Why China's capital exports can weaken imperialism. J. Tharappel. Abstract. The rise of China has prompted us geostrategic thinkers over the past decade to talk about the degree to which another world war is inevitable, and has also contributed to growing accusations that China is imperialist. It will be argued that it is possible to accuse China of imperialism under the definitional outline Vladimir Lenin popularized, but only because, in his model of the world, he considered the export of capital to be a defining feature of imperialism. However, this is flawed because his model had no theoretical space for the mechanisms of national exploitation that prevailed at that time, most importantly the drain of wealth from India. This is because Lenin's model was borrowed from that of John A. Hobson, who outright denied the drain. At the time, the claim of the drain was pioneered by Indian economist Dadabhai Naoroji, who in turn greatly influenced contemporary pioneers about the topic, namely Utsa Patnaik and Prabhat Patnaik, whose framework offers useful insights. After reconstructing the term imperialism, it will be argued that Chinese capital exports are actually weakening national exploitation, which is weakening imperialism and raising tensions, not towards inter-imperialist conflict, but hegemon, rival conflict. Introduction. The rising power and influence of China has prompted many U.S. geostrategic thinkers within the realist tradition to discuss the extent to which another world war is inevitable, if not advocate the necessity of aggressively containing China, which has prompted references to the 5th century BC Athenian general Thucydides, who famously wrote, "It was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable." Accordingly, the rise of China and the fear this instills in the US has also been accompanied by growing accusations that China is imperialist. This is important because regardless of the precise meaning of the term, which will be discussed in due course, there is no doubt that the term is pejorative, often taking the form of an accusation, and that is because it was originally popularized by Marxist-Leninist theory in that manner. Therefore, military conflict with China will increasingly be justified by the US and its allies, on the grounds that China is an imperialist power. In this context, the term imperialism must be clarified so it does not become an ideological weapon to manufacture consent for aggressive war, especially given the term was popularized with the opposite intention by Vladimir Lenin, who wanted to end WWI. Addressing the Second Congress of the Comintern in 1920, according to Lenin, the characteristic feature of imperialism consists in the whole world being divided into a large number of oppressed nations and insignificant number of oppressor nations, what can be called national exploitation, and that about 70% of the world's population belong to the oppressed nations, a clear reference to those nations subjugated by multiple rival empires. However, it will be argued that the definition according to Lenin in imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, does not explain the mechanisms of national exploitation, only class exploitation. Drawing on the methodology and insights of Utsa and Prabhat Patnaik, it will be argued that this theoretical shortcoming obscured the largest historically significant episodes of national exploitation that were in operation during Lenin's lifetime, the mechanisms by which they operated, and the manner in which they continue exerting influence today. Finally, it will be argued that a more relevant reconstruction of imperialism is possible, one capable of both identifying the mechanisms of national exploitation in operation today, as well as the underlying economic logic to the apparent inevitability of warfare between the preeminent power and the rising power as per the Thucydides trap. This can be done by complementing the core, periphery dialectic, popularized by neo-Marxists like Immanuel Wallerstein, with what can be called the hegemon, rival dialectic, which can be inferred from the works of Utsa Patnaik and Prabhat Patnaik, as well as Giovanni Arrighi. The accusations of Chinese imperialism. The rising power/influence of China has prompted many U.S. geostrategic thinkers over the past decade to talk about the degree to which another world war is inevitable, including Henry Kissinger, who warned that if the leaders of the US and China did not discuss the limits of their confrontation, then world war would ensue. According to Kissinger, our leaders and their leaders have to discuss the limits beyond which they will not push threats, and how to define that. You can say this is totally impossible, but if it is, we will slide into a situation similar to World War I. According to Cold Warrior and former advisor to U.S. President Reagan, Graham Allison, who contributed greatly to the Thucydides trap as a geopolitical concept within the Anglo-American realist discipline, war between the US and China in the decades ahead is not just possible, but much more likely than currently recognized. By contrast, China appears to downplay discussion about war. According to Chinese President Xi Jinping in 2017, we must all strive to avoid falling into the Thucydides trap. The notion that a great power is bound to seek hegemony doesn't apply to China, which lacks the gene that spawns such behavior. Indeed, for the past 3 decades, China's long-term strategy for dealing with the US is informed by the unwarlike maxim, hide your strength, bide your time, which was originally coined in 1989 by the Chinese Communist Party leadership under Deng Xiaoping. The US-China relationship, beginning with the recognition of the People's Republic of China by US President Nixon in 1972, was founded on the understanding that China would develop its productive forces by generating export surpluses in exchange for the US dollar, but ever since the global financial crisis of 2007 to 2008, the US has turned increasingly hostile towards China, particularly under the Trump presidency from 2016 onwards. According to Donald Trump's Vice President Mike Pence in October 2018, the Communist Party has set its sights on controlling 90% of the world's most advanced industries, including robotics, biotechnology, and artificial intelligence, through the wholesale theft of American technology, thereby setting the stage for Trump's trade war with China. Additionally, according to Pence, using that stolen technology, the Chinese Communist Party is turning plowshares into swords, thereby accusing China of preparing for war against the US, which logically would only have compelled China to do just that. In October 2020, Chinese President Xi Jinping delivered a speech to Chinese People's Liberation Army troops in Guangdong, instructing them to put their minds and energy on preparing for war, which is the latest development in the intensification of US-China tensions. In this context, China also stands accused of imperialism, increasingly by outlets that explicitly advocate US interests, such as, for example, the National Interest magazine, which in 2019 published articles authored by Doc and Thayer, alleging that imperialist China is invading Africa, and that Sino-imperialism refers to the risk of falling under the control of China largely through Chinese economic investment and loans. In December 2015, Jacobin, a publication marketed as Marxist, published an article by Dr. Ho Fung Hung suggesting that because the export of capital is central to Lenin's popular definition of the term imperialism, China, as a growing major capital exporter, is an imperialist power. Citing China's Belt and Road Initiative, Hung notes that as Lenin warned, the drive to export capital pushes states to project their political, and sometimes military, power abroad, leading to imperialist expansion and inter-imperial rivalry with other capital exporting countries. With the emphasis on sometimes, Hung is suggesting that even without any military projection by China, the BRI would still be an imperialist expansion. More recently in July 2020, Hung contended that the dynamics of US-China rivalry is an inter-imperial rivalry driven by inter-capitalist competition, which he again justified with reference to Lenin. Regardless of whether these authors even identify as Marxists, their characterization of China as imperialist is entirely consistent with the export of capital definition advanced by Vladimir Lenin in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, which in turn was influenced by imperialism, a study, authored by John A. Hobson. Indeed, according to Lenin, I made use of the principal English work, Imperialism, J. A. Hobson's book, with all the care that, in my opinion, that work deserves. Drawing upon the insights of Indian political economy, best represented today by the works of Utsa Patnaik and Prabhat Patnaik, it will be argued that the term imperialism advanced by Lenin was substantially flawed even for its time. This is insofar as it did not capture the actual mechanisms of national exploitation in operation during Lenin's lifetime, that is, the actual mechanisms by which nations exploit nations. What did Lenin mean by imperialism? The definition of imperialism proposed by Lenin in his pamphlet Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, was developed, during WWI, with the intention of empowering the communists in advanced capitalist countries with arguments for convincing the working classes of the various empires participating in WWI to use the opportunity to launch simultaneous socialist revolutions. For this purpose, Lenin proposed a general theory for explaining the war/militarism of his era, contesting that unless the economic essence of imperialism is studied, it will be impossible to understand and appraise modern war and modern politics. According to Lenin, the true class character of the war was that it was driven from within each empire by the interests of finance capital, whereas the working class in particular possessed both the interests and agency to end the war, especially given they were the ones being conscripted to fight in a conflict that ultimately claimed 17 million lives, the bloodiest conflict in human history until that point. What does Lenin mean by stating that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism? According to Lenin, typical of the old capitalism, when free competition held undivided sway, was the export of goods. Typical of the latest stage of capitalism, when monopolies rule, is the export of capital. According to this meta-narrative, the era of free competition is what defined old capitalism, which prevailed until the 1860s/1870s, when it began negating itself through the merging of bank capital with industrial capital, thus producing the era of imperialism, that is, the monopoly stage of capitalism, referring to the eventual subordination of industrial capital by finance capital, with the beginning of the 20th century marking the turning point. From the domination of capital in general to the domination of finance capital. Lenin observed that although formally banks functioned as intermediaries between different branches of industry by recycling deposits into loans, when such operations are multiplied and when the bank collects in its own hands enormous amounts of capital, the result is that the industrial capitalist becomes more completely dependent on the bank, and therefore, the banking sector transforms from a humble middleman into the most powerful agent within each empire. Governed by these interests, the state/empire takes on the responsibility of finding markets, only this time not only for the export of commodities, but also for the export of capital to seek higher profits in backward countries, through access to cheaper land, wages, and raw materials, thus necessitating war/militarism to acquire/defend territories from/against rival empires, each driven by the same logic, resulting in the tremendous boom in colonial conquests after the 1870s, a reference to the scramble for Africa and naval subjugation of China. The divergence between Naoroji and Hobson. Two books were published in 1901 and 1902 respectively, the first by Indian nationalist, economist, and politician Dada by Naoroji titled Poverty and Un-British Rule in India, the second by British social liberal John A. Hobson titled Imperialism, a Study. The former, Naoroji, influenced the Indian political tradition, based on his empirical research, which claims to have demonstrated that Britain exacted a very large surplus or drain of wealth from India during the era of the British Raj. To offer an indication of his influence, Naoroji has been called the venerable father of Indian political economy by Namboodiripad, who was the first Chief Minister of Kerala and a former General Secretary of the Communist Party of India. In contemporary Marxist discourse, Naoroji's empirical research has been expanded upon further by Utsa Patnaik and Prabhat Patnaik, whose insights have fundamentally reconceptualized the discourse about the meaning of imperialism. Regarding the latter, Hobson provided the foundational text for Lenin's understanding of imperialism, which poses a problem insofar as Hobson's model of imperialism denied the fundamental economic and historic realities of his own lifetime, most importantly, the fact that Britain expropriated a very large drain or surplus from its extractive colonies, most importantly India. Hobson was of the opinion that British rule benefited India, albeit marginally, by checking the corruption and tyranny of native princes, by introducing a public system of schools and colleges, by teaching the Christian religion, industrial arts, building roads, railways, by having reduced the burden of taxation, and thus amounted to the best record British imperialism can show. According to Hobson, there are some who maintain that British government is draining the economic lifeblood of India, and that 1/3 of the money raised by taxation flows out of the country. However, ultimately Hobson concludes that the statistical basis of this argument is too insecure for much reliance to be placed on it, thereby rejecting any notion that India was drained, that is, nationally exploited for the benefit for Britain. Hobson was clearly alluding to Nehoroji, whose book had been published a year earlier, without even mentioning his name, let alone discussing his exhaustive empirical research on the drain. The drain imposed on India consisted of Britain setting aside 1/3 of the tax revenues they raised from the Indian population to purchase goods from India, as well as expropriating India's foreign exchange earnings. Indians then needed to borrow back their plundered wealth, or as Nehoroji pointed out, India's own wealth is carried out of it, and then that wealth is brought back to it in the shape of loans, and for these loans she must find so much more for interest. Drawing upon Nehoroji's empirical research, Utsapatnaik calculated that this amounted to a net transfer of wealth or one-way drain from India to Britain of roughly £9.2 trillion between 1765 and 1938. That period, when extended to the end of World War II to include the Bengal famine, coincided with the worst famines ever experienced in Indian history, killing up to 49 to 51 million people, most of it directly attributable to British policy, according to the literature on the subject. From 1765 to 1938, this drain of wealth created the conditions for the first industrial revolution in Britain, and the subsequent export of capital, goods, and settlers. Drawing on Hobson's model, which denied the drain, Lenin assumed that the motivation behind imperialism, especially by Britain, was to secure external sources of demand, whereas for Nehoroji Britain was motivated to secure external sources of supply, both of goods and capital, particularly from India. Hobson argued, therefore, that imperialism would be unnecessary if wealth were more evenly distributed within Britain, arguing that if the consuming public in this country raised its standard of consumption to keep pace with every rise of productive powers, there could be no excess of goods or capital clamorous to use imperialism in order to find markets. Similarly, according to Lenin, surplus capital will be utilized not for the purpose of raising the standard of living of the masses in a given country, for this would mean a decline in profits for the capitalists, but for the purpose of increasing profits by exporting capital abroad to the backward countries. The overall implication is that the masses did not benefit from imperialism, which certainly aligned with his political message. The motivation behind exporting capital was, according to Lenin, because in backward countries profits are usually high, for capital is scarce, the price of land is relatively low, wages are low, raw materials are cheap. However, the assumption here was that of capitalism spreading evenly, which is why Lenin also wrote, "The export of capital influences and greatly accelerates the development of capitalism in those countries to which it is exported, and that it may tend to a certain extent to arrest development in the capital exporting countries." If this is the economic mechanism underpinning imperialism, then it implicitly rules out even the possibility of national exploitation, given that backward countries are being spurred into industrial development by externally originating capital, which is also at the economic expense of the imperial power. The economic mechanism central to imperialism for Hobson was essentially capital flight, which workers generally have an interest in opposing insofar as they would prefer that capital be invested at home, rather than invested in production overseas, that would then compete with home industry. Therefore, the theory of imperialism was originally intended to serve the interests of the working classes of the hegemon. It was not interested in examining national exploitation between oppressor and oppressed nations that came later with Lenin's reconceptualization in 1920, which also incidentally came about in dialogue with Indian Marxist M. N. Roy, who was one of the leading theoreticians at the Comintern at the time. 2. According to Lenin, the principal spheres of investment of British capital are the British colonies, but in that case, why did such capital exports not accelerate capitalist development in India as it did in the Anglo-settler colonies, since both were British colonies according to Lenin's categorization? To this question, Nehoroji argued that a distinction had to be drawn between two types of British colonies, a. settler colonies like the USA, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand that were recipients of capital investment, and b. colonies for plunder like India that were simply robbed by colonial state taxation. By contrast, Lenin did not differentiate between A and B, which becomes apparent from the statistical data he cited, according to which 69% of the capital exported by Britain, France, and Germany was invested in settler colonies, categorized by Lenin under the headings Europe and America, although presumably the figure would be even higher if the remaining 31% invested in Asia, Africa, and Australia differentiated between settler colonies like Australia and South Africa, and colonies for plunder like India. According to the Putnamiks, around 81% of British capital exports, or over 4/5 of export of capital from Britain, went to developing continental Europe, North America, and regions of recent white settlement such as Argentina, South Africa, and Australia, that is, to the A, the settler colonies, but also Europe, not to the B, colonies for plunder. In the final analysis, Hobson was wrong, Nehoroji was right, but because Hobson was of the opinion that imperialism did not benefit the British working class, whose interests were his primary concern, why would Indian nationalists like Nehoroji have any interest in proving him wrong by offering reasons why Britain benefited from draining India? Similarly, for Lenin to proclaim that his working class audience benefited from imperialism would have been counterproductive to his anti-war efforts. Reconstructing imperialism as national exploitation. The divergence between Nehoroji and Hobson embodies the divergence between two radically different trajectories in economic history, with India and China experiencing an absolute decline in incomes and rising mortality as a consequence of the financial tribute exacted by military subjugation to foreign powers, chief among them Britain. By contrast, the zones where most of the exported capital traveled to were parts of the world that have since the 19th century experienced growing incomes, which is why they tend to be first world countries. However, in more orthodox schools of Marxism there is no perceived difference, at a theoretical level, between these two divergent outcomes, rather, they are both cases of capitalism involving the exploitation of workers and or peasants by the capitalist class. To differentiate between these two divergent outcomes, it is important to establish a theoretical difference between class and national exploitation. Importantly, when imperialism is understood as national exploitation, the starting point is qualitatively different from that of class exploitation. This is because, according to Prabhat Patnaik, imperialism is immanent in the money form, which is an idea that proceeds as follows. According to Prabhat Patnaik, Marx rejected the notion of money being simply yet another commodity, which is in reference to capital, volume I, in which Marx points out that commodities have a dual character of both use value and exchange value, the former being its practical application in the real world, the latter being the ratio at which a commodity exchanges with other commodities. Money by contrast is not sought for its use value and as such has its own unique dual character in the sense of being both a medium of circulation and a measure of values, the latter being a claim on use values, or a means of storing wealth, or a hoard which Marx also called it. The model of class exploitation assumes a closed economy in which workers' wages and capitalists' profits are denominated in the same currency, which in turn exposes the inadequacy of treating money as a universal commodity, given that the actually existing world system features multiple states and currencies. However, if money is not just a means of exchanging use values, rather also a measure of value, this necessitates a conceptual model capturing competition among wealth-storing mediums, all of which are competing to promise the greatest anti-inflationary returns, that is, the greatest claim on use values in future. The Putnaik's analysis of money is useful for transcending the entirely valid neo-Marxist observation of the core, periphery dialectic by complementing it with a separate but overlapping hegemon, rival dialectic, namely that of the currency hegemon and the mercantile rival. Regarding the core, periphery dialectic, according to Emanuel Wallerstein, the world could be divided into core, periphery, and semi-periphery states, in which the peripheral countries produce primary commodities for the high value-added industries of the core, while the semi-periphery is somewhere in the middle of this global order. However, the problem is that categorizing nation-states in this manner presents a static image of the world that is frozen in time, rather than a dynamic model for explaining how the system negates itself by its own logic. According to Wallerstein, the degree of profitability of the production processes is directly related to the degree of monopolization, and therefore, the core countries are defined as such by their relative monopoly over advanced production, whereas the periphery countries are defined as such by their relative lack of such monopoly, which means the latter are subjected to greater competitive pressures. Complementing this well-established core, periphery dialectic, the hegemon, rival dialectic features a hegemon, which refers to the state with the currency that dominates global trade, as well as multiple mercantile rivals, which refers to those states that manage to industrialize by producing in exchange for the hegemonic currency. Here the term currency hegemony is used in the same sense Giovanni Arrighi used the term when he identified the four systemic cycles of accumulation under 1, Geno-Siberian, 2, Dutch, 3, British, and 4, U.S. hegemony. According to the Putnaiks, who similarly identify the hegemony of the US dollar, the hegemon must allow a current account deficit against itself by its rivals, because if they refused by enacting protectionist measures then it would undermine their hegemony. They argue that first Britain performed the role of the currency hegemon for which they maintained a current account deficit vis-a-vis continental Europe and the United States, then the United States took up that role in the post-war era and is doing the same today vis-a-vis Germany and East Asia, the latter two referring to the mercantile rivals of the present era. History demonstrates that past acts of imperial violence created the core periphery arrangement witnessed by Wallerstein, but what happens when that arrangement is peacefully subverted over time, either by the deindustrialization of the core or the industrialization of the periphery, or both? Does that mean imperialism ceases to exist, or alternatively, does it mean that the emerging core states become the new imperial powers, even if they did not employ violence to attain that position? Responding to these problems, David Harvey has argued that the old categories of imperialism do not work too well in these times, calling them crude and rigid, preferring instead to work with a theory of uneven geographical development. To justify his argument, Harvey cites the example of China, which has indeed become more core-like in its production processes, leading him to question, does this mean China is the new imperialist power? Answering yes to such a question would be to assume that core is synonymous with imperial power, but what if the state in question did not reach core status by engaging in national exploitation? Addressing the 13th Annual Forum of the World Association for Political Economy in 2018, Chinese Marxist Enfu Cheng alluded to this question, stating, "On this point, China should make clear that when its spokespeople say that their country is progressing to the center of the world economic arena, this does not mean that China intends to follow in the tracks of the new and old imperialist nationalism and colonialism of Western center countries. Indeed, to label a country imperialist for simply advancing their productive forces cheapens the concept of imperialism, preventing it from attaining its true potential. Furthermore, there is an ethical difference between a state that violently enforces a core, periphery relationship upon conquered nations, and a country like China that engages with other states on a win-win or quid pro quo basis, as Cheng also points out. To obscure this ethical difference would be to condemn development and romanticize poverty. Rather, one should differentiate between those states that seek to maintain the core, periphery structures originally founded by the violent conquests of past successive empires, and those states that, even by acting in their own self-interests, are weakening those dependency structures. Returning to the hegemon, rival dialectic, What allows the hegemon to issue the currency that dominates global trade? In the case of Britain, hegemony was attained by conquest, creating a polarization between core and periphery within the British Empire that effectively backed the value of the British pound sterling with freely acquired surpluses. Because Britain had access to the largest drain relative to all the other world powers, practicing relative free trade made logical sense for Britain. However, doing so stimulated the development of its mercantile rivals, which refers to those states that managed to catch up to the currency hegemon by industrializing under tariffs. In the lead-up to WWI, the hegemony of Britain ended as a consequence of growing trade deficits with its mercantile rivals, most importantly the US and Germany. These trade deficits began outweighing the surpluses Britain could drain from its exhausted subjugated peripheries, leading to speculative attacks on the gold-pound standard, which Britain was compelled to end by 1931. For more on this particular claim, see India in the World Economy 1900 to 1935, The Interwar Depression and Britain's Demise as World Capitalist Leader by Utsa Patnaik. Following this reconstruction, imperialism refers to the mechanisms of national exploitation, whereas capitalism refers to the mechanisms of class exploitation. A state becomes an empire, or imperialist, when it establishes a core, periphery relationship of national exploitation at the expense of a conquered nation. There can be many of these relationships in the sense of multiple coexisting empires. However, there is usually one that exacts the largest tribute or drain from its periphery. If the empire with the largest periphery manages to become the world's leading industrial power, then they may choose to establish currency hegemony over the empires or states they have not conquered. This involves the hegemon keeping its markets open for the goods of its rivals, thereby stimulating their industrial development. This is what creates the conditions for the Thucydides trap, that is, conflict between the hegemon and its mercantile rivals, but also for the subjugated peripheries of the various empires to launch national liberation struggles to free themselves from imperial rule. These wars can be called hegemon, rival wars, rather than inter-imperialist wars. In the case of the latter, both sides would need to preside over their own respective systems of core, periphery national exploitation for the conflict to be inter-imperialist, which in Lenin's time was certainly the norm. However, hegemon, rival conflict simply captures the purely economic contradiction of how the relationship between the free trade hegemon and its mercantile rivals evolve over time, regardless of whether the powers in question preside over their own systems of national exploitation or not. Hegemony may be founded upon imperialism, and it usually is, but it need not necessarily be the case. Similarly, a mercantile rival may also be founded upon imperialism, but not necessarily. Central to the hegemon, rival dialectic is the Thucydides trap, the basic notion that contrasts the decline of the preeminent hegemon with the rise of the rising mercantile rival, positing this as the engine for mounting economic contradictions to be resolved by other means, warfare. What is imperialism in the post-colonial era? What is imperialism in the post-colonial era after World War II? In this era, which extends into the present day, imperialism constitutes all attempts by the former empires to maintain the economic advantages won against their former extractive colonies. Therefore, imperialism is the attempt to maintain the core, periphery relations, or to quote Radhika Desai, to maintain unevenness. However, there is an argument to be made that imperialism did indeed weaken in the post-World War II era, as evidenced by the short lifespan of the US gold standard. Why was it that the US could only sustain a gold standard currency for 27 years, whereas Britain maintained a gold standard for over a century? The answer, according to the Patnaiks and Desai, is that in the absence of an easily plundered subjugated periphery of the kind that had guaranteed the stability of the British gold standard, the US gold standard was destined for a shorter innings than that of its predecessor. This is because, unlike Britain, which according to Indian Marxist Umayakumar Bugji could transfer capital resource from the non-white colonies to the white ones and support industrial growth in the latter, the US was faced with a rapidly decolonizing world, which according to the Putnamiks resulted in the weakening of imperialism in the period leading up to the Nixon shock of 1971. According to the Putnamiks, if the United States had had access to colonial grain in the era of the Bretton Woods system, as Britain had during the gold standard, then there would have been no outpouring of dollars, no build-up of claims against the United States, just as there had been no build-up of claims against Britain during the gold standard years despite its running persistent current deficits vis-a-vis other metropolitan powers. Similarly, according to Desai, bereft of colonies, the United States could never replicate these arrangements, and its liquidity provision through deficits would first drain its gold reserves. In the previous era of formal empires, the post-colonial nations were simply plundered for their resources, whereas upon gaining independence, access to those resources would require ostensibly quid pro quo approval, with some degree of negotiation, in exchange for the US dollar. What does imperialism mean in the post-colonial era? During the era of formal empires before World War II, direct military subjugation ensured the smooth transfer of surplus from the subjugated periphery to the hegemon. However, after the war, Asia and Africa gained independence. According to the Putnamiks, the immediate post-World War II era represented the weakening of imperialism in the sense that core-periphery relations weakened in this period. Therefore, having emerged out of World War II in the strongest position, the US established hegemony on the basis of its industrial supremacy at the time. However, unlike Britain's formal empire, the US was faced with a rapidly decolonizing world, making it possible for newly independent post-colonial states to have their own industrial revolutions by developing in a mercantile manner, and by producing in exchange for the US dollar. This weakening of imperialism phase identified by the Putnamiks happened because in the previous era of formal empires, the periphery nations were simply plundered, whereas upon gaining independence, access to their resources requires ostensibly quid pro quo approval. Ironically, this created the conditions for the export of capital by the new hegemon to the newly independent post-colonial world, not as an act of imperialism, rather as a consequence of imperialism weakening. In this reconstructed definition, there is nothing inherently imperialist about the export of capital by the US, rather, imperialism consists of the hegemon trying to maintain the value of its currency by attempting to freeze the global core-periphery relations that it inherited from the preceding hegemon by any means necessary. The Putnamiks argue that neoliberalism from the 1970s onwards represents the strengthening of imperialism insofar as the US began leveraging its hegemony to exact economic concessions from the post-colonial world, most importantly by demanding a. cutbacks on state spending, b. trade liberalization, and c. capital account liberalization. This resulted in the agrarian capacity of the post-colonial world in particular being reconstructed in the image of Western purchasing power, resulting in the diversion of agrarian land towards export crops, leaving less available for local consumption. Indeed, the Putnamiks, along with their political party, the Communist Party of India, largely attribute the mass protests across India to this ongoing structurally driven immiseration, which they accuse the current Modi government of exacerbating further by enacting new laws that experts like P. Sainath say will depress prices for farmers even further, resulting in further income deflation for the masses. However, there is also another side to neoliberalism, namely, that it was a period in which the preeminent hegemon stimulated the development of China, which is now the leading mercantile rival to the US. This allowed the US to back its currency with the products of cheaper Chinese labor in the medium term, but rather than remaining content with producing clothing and cheap manufactures for the US, the Chinese leadership proceeded to close the technological gap between itself and the US, which in turn, until 1991 was preoccupied with containing the Soviet Union. To Western audiences, neoliberalism represents merely a victory for the capitalist class. For example, according to David Harvey, who has contributed greatly to defining neoliberalism, the term refers to a class project that coalesced in the crisis of the 1970s. However, the definition Harvey provides, although not inaccurate, analyzes the term from the perspective of the working classes in the West, in that the political use of the term is said to have legitimized draconian policies designed to restore and consolidate capitalist class power. However, this perspective for defining the term effectively erases from its definition that neoliberalism was not just a class project but also a national project, one driven by the interests of the United States as part of its strategy for upholding global currency hegemony. According to this reconceptualist model, neoliberalism also importantly represents a divergence within the post-colonial camp of nations, particularly between India and China, the former drifting back towards the terms of trade that prevailed under British rule, the latter forging ahead towards technological parity with the US. The process by which a mercantile rival attains hegemony can have the unintended consequence of weakening the core, periphery relations that the previous hegemon had established. For example, the US demanded that Britain decolonize in exchange for support during World War II. At a 1941 conference with Britain, Roosevelt demanded that one of the preconditions of any lasting peace will have to be the greatest possible freedom of trade, that is, no artificial barriers blocking US entry into the markets of Britain's periphery colonies. At the insistence of Roosevelt, and despite the reluctance of Churchill, the Atlantic Charter produced by these negotiations included an article on self-determination, promising that after the war, Britain would respect the right of all peoples to choose the form of government under which they will live and wish to see sovereign rights and self-government restored to those who have been forcibly deprived of them, statements of principle that would form the basis of the 1945 UN Charter. Therefore, the US contributed towards weakening the core, periphery relations established by Britain, which it did as a means of attaining currency hegemony, but once in the position of the hegemon the US sought to freeze global core, periphery relations. Former US official George Kennan, one of the architects of the US post-war order, espoused this particular logic of hegemony. We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity. This involved de-obstructing the industrial evolution of periphery states into mercantile rivals, regardless of whether they industrialize by capitalist or socialist means, as this is merely a question of internal class structure. In hindsight, US attempts to freeze global core, periphery relations have clearly failed. By 1950, the US share of exports in manufactured goods peaked at 26.6% of the world total, which by 1967 had fallen to 20.6%. Eventually, for the US, the trade surpluses turned to deficits in 1977, and from 1985 onwards, the US has become a net debtor that relies on loans from the rest of the world, most importantly loans from China, which is the leading mercantile rival to US hegemony today. Even the invectives against China by the Trump administration reveals an ailing hegemon lashing out at its leading mercantile rival, or this mercantilist totalitarian system, which is how Trump's former advisor Steve Bannon described China. Drawing on Trotsky's dichotomy of uneven and combined development, it has been suggested by Priya Chacko and Kanishka Jayasuriya, that China seeks to maintain uneven development through the regulatory geography that governs the BRI. If this were true, then one could argue that China is imperialist for seeking to maintain unevenness, which is how Desai defines the term. Anticipating such criticism, this paper encourages a dialectical approach towards history, which begins by noting the double-edged nature of currency hegemony. On the one hand, the US can print its imports, thereby allowing the US to run the largest absolute net current account deficit and net external debt on Earth, without experiencing too serious inflation. On the other hand, the ability of the US to print their imports undermines the productive forces within the US over the long term, resulting in growing inequality and societal breakdown of the kind currently being witnessed there, where 40% of US Americans do not have $400 for emergency expenses. By contrast, China runs the largest absolute surpluses of both goods and capital, which offers more options for the world's former colonist peripheries across the post-colonial world, and greater competition for the Anglo-American financial empire, and its associated lending institutions, chiefly the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. In other words, even if China seeks to maintain uneven development, the fact that they are in competition with the US is positive for post-colonial countries insofar as it gives the latter more options for developing in a mercantile manner, resulting in the tendency towards combined development rather than uneven development. In other words, hegemon, rival economic competition can structurally facilitate peripheral post-colonial development, regardless of whether the hegemon or rival wants this to happen. This is what happened when the US under Roosevelt was the rising rival against British hegemony. If imperialism theory was originally supposed to consciously mobilize against the hegemon, rival warfare of the kind that took place in WWI, then perhaps the more definitive question would be to ask which side, the hegemon or the rival, has the greater interest in peace, and conversely the greater interest in war? The answer is both theoretical and historically contextual. The evidence suggests that the current hegemon has an interest in destabilizing the outside world in order to prompt financial flows into the US banking system. According to Brookings Institute expert Dr. Eshvar Prasad, it is striking that, so far during 2019, amid all the trade wars, geopolitical tensions, and economic and political recriminations against the U.S., foreign central banks in aggregate have been net purchasers of U.S. Treasury securities. Given that geopolitical tensions appear to cause a strengthening of the U.S. dollar, this raises the plausible necessity of economic and military aggression by the U.S. to preserve the hegemony of the dollar. According to this geostrategy, the U.S. financial system offers itself as the solution, or safe haven, to the geopolitical tensions that the U.S. contributed towards in the first place. Although Prasad does not acknowledge any causal relationship between the U.S. financial system and U.S. military power, he also uses the phrase protection money to refer to the purchase of U.S. dollar assets, which is curious wording insofar as this phrase is also a euphemism for extortion. According to Prasad, here is so much turmoil that countries around the world seem willing to pay this huge price in order to protect themselves. In other words, turmoil is good for US dollar hegemony because of the influx of protection money that comes with it. Has there ever been an admission by the US government or its affiliated institutional advocates that they favor instability in Eurasia? According to George Friedman, founder of Stratfor, a U.S. geostrategic think tank that has been called the Shadow CIA by News Corp publication Barron's, the United States has no overriding interest in peace in Eurasia, rather the purpose of these conflicts is simply to block a power or destabilize the region, not to impose order. Friedman also argues that to maintain the Eurasian balance of power is and will remain the driving force of U.S. foreign policy throughout the 21st century, and that U.S. actions will appear irrational, and would be if the primary goal is to stabilize the Balkans or the Middle East. This is from his book titled The Next 100 Years, A Forecast for the 21st Century, which was written in 2009, on the eve of the immensely destructive Arab Spring Wars. The term imperialism must identify where the impetus towards warfare is coming from if the purpose is to mobilize against it. In the present context, the evidence suggests that it is the declining preeminent hegemon that has an interest in military escalation, because from its perspective, trade relations with the rest of the world are getting worse, whereas for the rising mercantile rival, trade relations with the rest of the world are getting better, without any need to exercise force. Finally, if imperialism consists of the hegemon trying to maintain the value of its currency by obstructing the industrial evolution of peripheries into mercantile rivals, then it logically follows that capital exports from mercantile rivals like China to the periphery economies of Africa can undermine the economic advantages that the preeminent hegemon had hitherto taken for granted, thereby undermining imperialism. China transformed into a net exporter of capital in 2000 and since 2015 has grown to become the largest net exporter of capital in the world, but like the exports of capital by Britain, these exports are an industrializing force in the countries they are exported to, rather than a deindustrializing force, which is what defined the national exploitation of India, China, and African nations by Britain. That Africa is rapidly industrializing as a consequence of Chinese investment is widely acknowledged. According to the IMF, Sub-Saharan Africa is the second fastest growing region of the world today, trailing only developing Asia. According to the American Enterprise Institute, the value of China's overseas investment and construction combined since 2005 exceeds $2 trillion, with $304 billion invested in sub-Saharan Africa alone. Chinese investment is rising, while US and European investment is falling in Africa since 2011. China represents 40% of the investment for developing Africa's infrastructure, whereas the US share declined from 24% to 6.7%, while the European share fell from 44% to 34%. According to Dr. Parag Khanna, author of The Future is Asian, the reason why China established the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank was because the World Bank turned away from financing major infrastructure projects more than 5 decades ago. Therefore, by aiding the industrialization of Africa, China's capital exports perform a similar role to British capital exports to its settler colonies and to Western Europe, insofar as it results in the diffusion of industrial production. And most importantly, China is not draining Africa of its wealth following military conquests the way Britain drained Asia and Africa. Indeed, China does not have a military presence in Africa, merely an economic one, founded on its current status as the industrial supply depot of the world economy. Naturally, the processes of industrialization have always had negative consequences of the kind referred to by Doc and Thayer, which then adds to the emotive thrust behind the charge of imperialism against Chinese capital exports, but these are the consequences of industrialization everywhere, including within Britain and other advanced capitalist countries. Furthermore, given that imperialism consists of the hegemon trying to maintain the value of its currency, it follows that the US would much rather China export capital to the US, thereby upholding US dollar hegemony, rather than exporting capital to the post-colonial world. The US has an interest in maintaining, if not increasing the flow of capital from China to the Anglo-American financial system, especially to capture capital flight. According to figures released in 2016, by Global Financial Integrity and the Center for Applied Research at the Norwegian School of Economics, since 1980, developing countries have lost an estimated $16.3 trillion due to broad leakages in the balance of payments, trade misinvoicing, and recorded financial transfers, i.e. capital flight, of which the Chinese share alone is $4.6 trillion. In 2015, former U.S. Secretary of the Treasury Henry Paulson revealed in his book Dealing with China that Russia was attempting to convince China to sell its U.S. debt securities, but that such a scenario was averted because the Chinese showed admirable resolve in cooperating with our government and in maintaining their holdings of U.S. securities throughout the crisis. However, the willingness of China to continue financing the hegemon's debt seems to be weakening. Although the composition of China's foreign exchange reserves is a state secret, its government periodically releases important revelations suggesting that in the 2000s, the share of US dollar-denominated assets as a percentage of China's total foreign exchange reserves peaked, then began falling. In July 2019, China revealed that its holdings of US dollar-denominated assets as a percentage of its total foreign exchange reserves had fallen from 79% in 2005 to 58% in 2014, the latter figure being lower than the global average of 65% in 2014. The US dollar is preeminently held as a global measure of value more so than as a means of exchange, let alone as a means of exchange solely for purchasing US goods, whereas the Chinese renminbi, the currency of the rising mercantile rival, is held, largely as a means of exchange for Chinese goods. Today, the renminbi represents a competitive threat to the US dollar insofar as China is rolling out plans for the evolution of its currency, from purely a means of exchange for Chinese goods, into a measure of value, thereby edging it closer to the properties that define US currency hegemony. China also has plans in the near future to conduct half its trade in renminbi and is developing rival cryptocurrency infrastructure so that it can evade the long arm of the U.S. Treasury Department. Therefore, the U.S. is being forced to compete for capital with China, which can only worsen the U.S. current account deficit by potentially raising the cost of borrowing. For example, Kunna notes that at present, foreigners own only around 2% of China's external debt. However, the Chinese government plans to increase this to 15% by issuing panda bonds valued at $3 trillion in liquidity by 2025, that have even been purchased by Standard Chartered in Britain, and similarly, in the private sector China's financial asset markets are expected to grow from $3 trillion today, to $15 trillion by 2025. Does this mean currency hegemony is synonymous with imperialism? No. Imperialism is established through the conquest of core, periphery relations of national exploitation, the relative economic success of which allows for the possibility of currency hegemony. However, this does not mean that currency hegemony is inherently imperialist, and that's because it need not be established through conquest. Rather, it can potentially instead be established through the industrial dynamism and/or resource wealth of the state in question. Attaining hegemony can get to a late stage where the hegemon feels compelled to go down the path of disrupting capital exports from the mercantile rivals to the periphery, that is, disrupting mercantile, periphery synergy. If China should attain currency hegemony, would they go down that path? The future is unwritten, but it can be said that having currency hegemony does tend to erode domestic industries, especially when the state does not discipline its capitalist class by forcing capital to invest according to state planning requirements, and by preventing the export of capital, which would then escape to stimulate the development of foreign countries. Conclusion. The rise of China as a net exporter of capital, and the fear this instills in the U.S., which is the largest net importer of capital, helps explain why advocates of U.S. interests have over the past decade become fervent anti-imperialists for reasons that are entirely consistent with Lenin's imperialism, which was founded upon the drain denialism of Hobson. However, those reasons do not reflect the spirit of what Lenin meant by imperialism insofar as it failed to adequately capture the actual mechanisms of national exploitation that predominated in Lenin's lifetime, mechanisms that Lenin's 1920 speech invited communists across the world to further elucidate. The Leninist theory of imperialism was intended to stop WWI by putting the argument to the European working class that their respective capitalist ruling classes were exporting capital to take advantage of cheap labor and resources overseas, rather than raising wages at home, ultimately leading to war between empires. Ironically, taking advantage of cheap labor in this manner is what the US did when they exported capital to China at the expense of their domestic manufacturing, thereby contributing to the economic rise of China in the first place. Was China a victim of US imperialism by receiving these capital inflows? No, this was a quid pro quo relationship founded on capitalist mechanisms of class exploitation. However, there was no national exploitation. Now China is doing the same by exporting capital overseas, particularly to Africa, but in this situation, the charge of imperialism as the export of capital is being weaponized by advocates of US interests to justify the aggressive containment of China, that is, to justify war, which is the exact opposite of what Lenin intended, which was to end war. Does this new model offer any insights for avoiding war? Returning to the more familiar ground of class exploitation, now is the time to appeal to the US working class and unemployed poor with the message that if they gave up currency hegemony, industries would return to the US, largely as a consequence of import prices rising. One possible solution is for the hegemon to ask its rivals how many US dollars they are willing to simply destroy in exchange for geostrategic concessions, such as the removal of the US military presence from various parts of the world. Indeed, many Americans voted for Trump because of the promise that he would work to close the trade deficit with China and end US involvement in wars in the Middle East, which shows that Americans would certainly be receptive to the prospect of giving up currency hegemony for the chance to reindustrialize.